Dwight Eisenhower had more experience with foreign policy, certainly, than he did with domestic policy or domestic affairs. As president, he accepted certain basic assumptions about the Cold War and about the intentions and the threats that came with communism that the United States confronted. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles assisted Eisenhower in constructing the Eisenhower foreign policy. He believed that containment sounded too defensive, too weak. So Dulles began speaking of liberation or of rolling back communism. And you see this rhetoric occurring during the election of 1952. But it's also worth noting that you see it from subsequent presidents as well. John F. Kennedy is a really good example because in 1960, Kennedy will criticize the Eisenhower administrations of the 1950s for being too weak and will himself talk about not just containing but pushing back communism. Part of the problem here, though, is sheerly monetary. I mentioned in the last segment the degree to which the United States is beginning to see the cost of maintaining the level of military spending needed to just contain what they see as Soviet expansion around the world. Harry Truman had left Eisenhower with a massive federal budget. Eisenhower wanted to cut back the budget. He wanted to be more strict with American taxpayers' money and revenue and trim federal spending along the edges, not completely drive it back to the 1920s. We're not talking about isolation here, and we're not talking about government deregulation entirely, but we are talking about a sort of rolling back of government spending. So what we begin to see during the Eisenhower presidency will be efforts to find ways to maintain America's presence in the world through less expensive means. And it turns out that one of those less expensive means would be an emphasis on our air power. Sorry, I about said our power, but air power, right? The capacity to deliver weapons via the air without the need to maintain the vast numbers of American troops or conventional weapons that might be required if we didn't rely on air power. We're already keeping troops in Europe. We're now going to keep troops in Korea. There are going to be expenses, but limit those expenses as much as possible and focus on the military weaponry that gives you the biggest, and I hate to say this, but the biggest bang for the buck. Now, de-emphasizing conventional weapons, looking to build new and better bombers and fighters, like in Korea, the Sabre that evolves, will lead the United States toward a heavy dependence on two things. I mentioned air power. So three things maybe, but air power aside, one will be nuclear weapons. A second sort of point of American dependence, or a point at the heart of American foreign policy, will be dependence on special forces. Let's put it that way. The CIA, but also specially trained military personnel whose purpose will be to utilize resources around them to achieve certain ends in the national interest with less expense and less political cost in terms of American lives than what we saw lost in Korea. In other words, why launch an entire invasion of another country if you can begin building a consensus in that country itself? You can play on animosities already existing in that country and still achieve the same end by perhaps overthrowing a government. So, again, a cheaper but no less successful kind of foreign policy is what Eisenhower desires. There are going to be some huge huge consequences for this Eisenhower foreign policy. And let me suggest, sort of by looking at some statistics here, let me suggest what at least one of those will be. The hydrogen bomb. In November of 1952, the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb. In March 1954, an even larger, more powerful hydrogen bomb would be exploded over the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. And of course, for those of you who wonder, that is kind of where we get this title for the female two-part swimsuit, the bikini, right? The Bikini Atoll in this nuclear test. Now, just to give you some idea of the 1954 explosion, understand that it's a 15 megaton explosion. 15 megaton. Understand that the hydrogen bomb is over 100 times, or around 100 times more powerful than the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And understand then further that by the 1960s, the United States had created hydrogen-based bombs that were 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 1,000 times more powerful. Multiple warhead capacity so that you could drop multiple of these from the air. Understand too that as with Berlin earlier, and as with the atomic bomb in its original kind of shape and form and power, it didn't take the Soviets very long to get their own hydrogen bombs. In fact, by 1953, the Soviets were testing their own hydrogen bomb. What this means is that in 1949, yeah, you had the US and you had the Soviets with bombs, nuclear weapons. But by the end of the 1950s, you're really talking about a capacity for global destruction. So how did the United States intend to employ these weapons strategically? I mean, that's a fair question. And I think if you look at it, the idea that evolves is one of deterrence. Deterrence, based on that root deter, simply means that I want to use nuclear weapons, I don't want to use nuclear weapons. Maybe that's a better way to put it. I never want to use them, but I want to have them so that my opponent, my enemy, understands that I have them, and that if my enemy decides to use nuclear weapons, I have sufficient numbers of sufficient power that the retaliation will be massive. In other words, you launch a nuclear missile at me or one of my cities, and I will launch everything I've got or part of what I've got, and I will just wipe you off the face of the earth. I will leave a big hole where your nation was. That massive retaliation lies at the heart of deterrence. And that's why, ultimately, you could argue that this idea exists that nuclear weapons would be a cheaper, in terms of money, a cheaper route than maintaining massive conventional forces. Remember that in 1948, the United States had reinstituted selective service in the draft. But that was costly. You could maintain nuclear missiles at far less expense, but still ensure that the big war was a thing no one wanted. Now, the downside, of course, of using massive resistance as part of deterrence is, of course, fear. Because you never know when a minor incident could escalate all the way to total destruction of the earth, the extinction of humanity and who knows what all, maybe most, biological organisms, who knows. Certainly society would never have been the same. If it were necessary, Nations had to ask themselves how far they were willing to go when they were in essence playing poker with the lives of humanity. Because to have those nuclear weapons and to use them as a deterrent might well mean that when it came down to it, you would have to say, if you go one step further, Soviet Union, I'll use these nuclear weapons. The policies of the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1950s create a kind of situation where both sides come to depend upon deterrence. And as a result, a situation that lends itself to what we call Brinksmanship. In order for the threat to be effective, you've got to be willing to go to the brink of total annihilation, even if it's a bluff. And that's the frightening thing. That's the frightening thing, because you never know when it's a bluff. You never know when one wrong move could make it real, all too real. It's worth noting here that there are also massive changes underway around the globe that will be caused by this Cold War. And we'll talk more about that in just a bit, but when I talk about these massive changes, what I really mean is how the world is organized. I mentioned earlier that there would be those nations that were clearly within the camp of the Soviet Union, and there would be those nations clearly within the camp of the United States and its allies. But there were also those nations that refused to join either camp, that sought neutrality. They sought what would come to be known as a third way. And thus, these nations, we call them often, or did call them, the Third World. The Third World. I mentioned the growth of power in nuclear weapons, just briefly. What begins in the 1950s in a big way is an arms race. It's nothing less than an arms race in which neither side is willing to live with less than the other seems to have. And it is often a matter of what the other seems to have. Just to give you a quick rundown, I mentioned, of course, the creation of the hydrogen bomb and far more powerful nuclear devices over the course of the 1950s. But there are some other technical marvels that you'll probably want to know about. In August of 1957, the Soviet Union fired the first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. And of course, as the name implies, this was a missile with enough guidance capacity to be targeted from the Soviet Union really to North America and to the United States. In October of that same year, 1957, the Soviets, using their rocket technology, much of which, as with American rocket technology, had come from Germany, the Soviets launched the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth. Of course, that was Sputnik. And Sputnik wasn't much by today's standards. You know, it was just a little orb about the size of a basketball. And it basically went around the Earth going beep, 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 beep. You know, it just beeped. But you got to kind of understand the mentality at this point. Americans could potentially pick up that beeping via radio signal. And there was the knowledge then that the Soviets had managed to put into space over the United States, over its airspace, a technological wonder. And it made Americans really begin to ask by the mid to late 1950s, as the Soviets displayed their capacity for the development of technology, what were the Soviets up to? What were they able to accomplish? And were they ahead of us? Was the Soviet Union advanced beyond the United States in its technological capacity. It led the United States to a response of its own. Already, Americans, as I said, were tense. They developed a sense of great vulnerability, and that didn't play well politically for the Eisenhower administration. But the fact is, U.S. spy planes were already flying over the Soviet Union at high altitude, taking photographs, and were aware of just how few ICBMs the Soviet Union actually had. Nonetheless, critics of the Eisenhower administration in particular charged that what had developed in the U.S. was an apathy for scientific innovation, for keeping up with the Soviets, and what came to be known as a missile gap. That the United States was behind the Soviet Union technologically. And so the United States will test its own ICBMs, but also the U.S. will enlarge its fleet of B-52 bombers. These are bombers capable of long-distance, long-length flight that were capable of dropping nuclear weapons and flying between continents to do so. We would also take advantage of the position Europe had in relation to the Soviet Union and would place medium-range or intermediate-range missiles in Europe with nuclear warheads capable of easily reaching the Soviet Union. In terms of policy, in 1958, the United States government created the National Aeronautics and Space Agency, or NASA. This agency was assigned to enhance America's technical capacity when it came to flight, but also space flight. And ultimately, it will be NASA that will begin the programs that the Kennedy administration will put to use sending humanity to the moon. But it wasn't just creating NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and all that. It's also pushing education through public education. It's one of the reasons that public education really expands greatly in the 1950s. Congress passes the National Defense Education Act, which encourages American students to take math and science to develop skills in language to prepare them really to win in this global conflict of the Cold War. Loans are offered to college students, and it's really here in the 1950s that we see college, the GI Bill, for instance, coming along in the 40s, and then the push for greater technical advancement and ability in the American workforce that pushes higher education on the American people, the idea of the college degree. By the end of the 1960s, the United States has begun using its submarine forces as platforms for delivery of nuclear weapons as well. The reality was that the United States really wasn't behind technologically. But the paranoia, the fear was there. And that fear reflects the feeling of Americans during the Cold War, but not just the U.S., not just Americans, the world. This arms race heightens the potential for global destruction.